Hello, everyone. Welcome to our called Coffee ELT Podcast. My name is Nataly Naradovska Reese, and today here with me is Chris Reese. So, the topic of our podcast today is how to deal with our students' complaints. Almost every day, teachers deal with some form of complaint, question, or challenge from our students who may not understand why or how some activities or tasks help them learn. And it seems that uh, being able to deal with such complaints is a must have skill for every teacher, unless we want to be caught off guard. So, me myself, having spent over a decade in a classroom and having dealt with, having worked with kids, teenagers, adults, with corporate clients, having taught business English, and having prepared students for exams. I have experienced quite a few complaints over my career. And the same for Chris. I know that you are quite experienced, both teacher and teacher trainer. So could you please tell us, Chris, what kind of complaints have you dealt with?
Yeah, no, students really love to complain. That's one kind of constant throughout everything. And I've probably seen everything you could possibly imagine, at least for people who work in a school. So my background dealing with complaints would be mostly originally working in a language school as a teacher,
Mhm.
mostly working in language schools, and then moving into ELT management from that point. So looking at them from the point of view not of the teacher, but of the academic manager, academic director, director of studies,
Mhm.
from the management perspective, and also working in teacher education and teacher training on things like the CELTA, the Delta Module 1, CELT-P, CELT-S courses when they were still a thing, where I've also dealt with more than my fair share of complaints um, for every reason under the sun. So yeah, people certainly do love to complain.
So, having said that, I prepared a list of different complaints
Mhm.
that I've heard quite a lot from my students, and I'm sure that um, you have the same. So let's get started, right?
Sure.
The first complaint is, of course, why do I need to read or write this in the classroom?
Oh, yeah, that's a really common one, especially coming from students who have more traditional learning backgrounds, where maybe in terms of their language education, things like grammar and vocabulary were prioritized in class, and things like reading and writing were considered to be something additional or something to be done at home. And well, if we're completely honest, a lot of reading and writing can and should be done at home.
Mhm.
The issue comes that, well, it shouldn't only be done at home. Because if we talk about, for example, a very long text, like a story, it's like 20, 30 pages or something like that, of course, that should be read at home. And this sort of extensive reading is really helpful for learners to develop their vocabularies, especially to develop this love of engaging with language. But at the same time, um, giving them shorter texts for more intensive reading in class gives us the chance to focus on more specific sub skills and to help the learners be able to read better. And that's a process that I think is very important to highlight to the learners. That is, if they can feel that your reading lessons are useful and that you are helping them to read better in a way that they might not be able to do on their own,
Mhm.
then they'll probably start to value reading lessons a little bit more. But if you're consistently hearing this from the learners that, oh, we just read in class and I feel like I'm wasting my time, well, they might be. They might actually be wasting their time. And the way that we're
And
teaching reading,
sorry to
yeah,
interrupt you, but actually, not only wasting our time, sometimes it might feel as a punishment,
right,
actually, because I remember myself being a student at school. Uh, Very often
yes,
we would get like a task to write something
yes,
as a punishment, and then would get not very good marks for that because we were not prepared. Or
right. So thinking more about, so on the one hand, kind of preempting this by thinking more about how am I preparing students for this and helping them do it.
Mhm.
But on the other hand, sitting down with the students and brainstorming with them, okay, so why might we be doing this? Okay, well,
Mhm.
actually, because here I'm helping you plan, here I'm teaching you some language, here we're analyzing a model together.
Right, yeah.
So why do I want you to do it in class? Well, because if I let you do it at home, you
Mhm.
might spend an hour doing it, but that's not really practical. If you get a job working in an English speaking company, you're not going to be able to spend an hour, or 15% of your working day writing every email. Congratulations, you've written 8 emails, time to go home. I don't think you'll survive in your job very long if you do this. And I'm speaking from a position where when my first academic director job, I had to do all of my professional communication with the general directors, not in English. I had to do it in my second language. So I know what it's like to spend time painstakingly writing emails and things like that. And you eventually have to get to a point where you're comfortable doing it with a time limit.
Fair enough. Yeah. So you just need to be clear about that with your students.
Yeah.
All right. Next question. When we give our students something to listen to, and they listen, and then they say, "I didn't understand anything. Why do they speak so fast?"
Yeah, this is a really common one. I think it's really important to understand where the student is coming from for this. Because when I think of the profile of a student who's telling me this, I think this is probably a student who's not the most fluent, maybe has some difficulties with fluency, maybe even is very accurate, but struggles with fluency. Probably struggles a bit with their pronunciation and probably has a very thick accent. That is to say, their first language is very heavily influencing their pronunciation. And I think it may also come from the way that we present language, because very often we have this belief that true language, air quote unquote, true language is reflected in writing. But actually, writing, even as a process, is relatively new. If you look at the history of human evolution, we've existed for anthropologists now believe something so on 200,000 years, and we've only had writing for 10,000 of those. So writing is a relatively new invention and concept in terms of language. So the real way that language exists isn't in writing, but in speaking. The problem is that because we put such an emphasis on the written form of language, students may consciously or unconsciously have the belief that, the written sentence is what language should sound like. And it's like, no. Anyone who's studied French is really, really well aware of this, that the way you write it and the way you speak it are completely different.
And students very often complain about English.
Right, because English has the same problem.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, next one. When we have, for example, a lesson on a vocabulary lesson, and we teach quite a few new words. Sometimes it may be like 5, 8, and sometimes it gets very difficult, and our learners might get like 20, 25 new words. And the question they usually ask is, why do I need to learn so many new words?
Well, and again, I think it's really important to look at where the student's coming from with this, because if a student's got 25 new words in one lesson, probably that lesson was not pitched at their level. Because ideally, if I teach a set of lexes, I want to have no more than 9 new words. I might have others that I've revised, but in terms of completely new, brand new for the student, probably 9 is going to be about the upper limit. And that's got to deal with how much you can possibly learn at once, constraints of working memory. And even 9 is a little bit like, that's a hard maximum. If they're completely new, it's really going to be about 5, 6, 7, depending on the person, their capacity for studying, how awake they are, other factors like this. So that would immediately be my first thing, is that if they're complaining about this, well, why do I need to know so many words? Probably what the student is really telling me is, I feel a little bit overloaded with what's going on. So maybe dialing back the amount that you're teaching at once could be the answer.
And that's actually, I think state school teachers will really appreciate to hear the answer to that question. What do I do if I teach, for example, focus, any level of focus? Every single unit starts with a vocabulary lesson where they get like, I don't know,
20.
Well, sometimes more even, really. So what do I do then?
Well, I think the way to do it is you've got to break it down into bite-sized chunks, even if this means that you've got to move more slowly, because what can often happen, especially if you're a state school teacher, and I know a thing or two about this because, well, I've worked in mainstream education as a in mainstream education as a teacher as well, where the students are grouped by year, not by ability level.
Yeah.
Which means that you could very well have a group who is, let's say, under level, studying with a book that they really shouldn't be studying with, where, yeah, this set of 20 lexis and all of them are new, whereas the course book writers maybe intended 10 of them to be new. In such cases, you've got to slow down and break it up. One rule which I've heard quite recently, which I've heard reiterated quite recently, a way to think about it is the way that we teach any amount of information should be something bite-sized, which I can learn quickly and which I can apply immediately. So rather than having this big, long clarification, 20 words, well, even focus, by the way, has this where it's clarify 5, practice, practice, clarify 5 more, practice, practice, clarify 5 more, practice, practice, clarify 5 more, practice, practice.
Yeah.
Then you open the photocopyables and ta-da, there's going to be a task which practices everything. So not thinking, okay, I need to teach all of these words at once, but I'm going to break it up into little chunks. And I think that that's going to be the hows of how you deal with learning lots of words and things like that. And the other thing is that, well, the students, they may come at it from the point of view of, well, why do I need to know 5 ways to say that I'm angry?
Yeah.
Why do I need to know that I'm angry, I'm frustrated, I'm annoyed, I'm furious, and why can't I just say that I'm angry? And it's useful explaining to them. One metaphor that I like is I like to think about language as a car that kind of gets me where I'm going.
Yeah.
And I can get where I'm going in an old, beat up Ford Focus, from 1984, that's barely running, and you hear knocking coming from the engine. It'll get you there, but you may have some trouble. Or my language can be a Mercedes. It's going to get me there in comfort and in style, and it's going to get me there quicker with less effort. So I think that can be a very useful thing for them to think about as well.
I think this is one of those key takeaways from this podcast for teachers. Yeah. Okay. So next question. Talking about vocabulary and memorizing so many words and stuff, what about phrasal verbs and collocations? Because again, just recently I received a question from one of my students, like, so if I just say a simple verb, will they understand me? Why can't I just say a simple verb? Why do I need to use this phrasal verb if it's basically more or less the same?
Right.
Why do I need to memorize so many phrasal verbs? And
right.
Why do actually native speakers use so many phrasal verbs when they speak?
Right. Well, one thing that I think, one of the reasons for this is that, like we said before, it's about this point about making your language into a Mercedes, not a Ford Focus. Nothing wrong with a Ford Focus, but it's a good car, it's reliable. But if we can make it better, let's make it better. I think the other thing as well is to give precision. Very often I hear this really mistaken belief from teachers that, for example, this is a B1 word, this is a B2 word, this is a C1 word.
Even sometimes when you open a dictionary, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Cambridge Dictionary suggests that this is, for example, a C1 word or C2
word. And what they mean by that is not that this word is like C1 and therefore it should not be taught until C1. What they actually mean by that is that according to the corpuses of data that we've got, or the corpora of data that we've got from learners completing things like standardized exams, that this word does not frequently appear in learners' language until this level of proficiency. So there may be value in teaching it before then, but they're not going to use it reliably and appropriately until about this level. So as long as we go in knowing that, that's fine. And I think it's important for learners to know that, but I think it's also important for them to point out that the English that they speak is not going to be the English that they hear. That they may say, well, other people will understand me. Well, yes, but will you understand them? And that's really, really important. That's just as important as them understanding you. Will you be able to understand them? And not just will you be able to understand them generally, but will you be able to understand them in a precise way so that you know exactly what they mean? And you may think, well, but when do I need to understand precisely what people mean? Come on. Well, let's see. If you're stopped by a police officer, could be really important to know exactly what he's talking about. If you talk with a lawyer, if you are on a date, could be pretty important to know kind of how exactly they're feeling, what exactly they mean. And there's lots of situations like this that are high stakes where you do need to know exactly what's going on. And in such cases, you won't if you don't know these words. And it's useful asking the learners to think about, in this case, low stakes versus high stakes. Because maybe the majority of situations in which they use English in their lives right now are low stakes. So they're not thinking about these high stakes situations. But maybe they also want to transition to, maybe they want to work in an English speaking company where your proportion of high stakes encounters in English are going to rise dramatically.
It's a very good point. We need to take away that, learning just for the sake of learning.
Right.
And they really need to be aware of this possibility in the future that they will have to use language in real life, especially now happens that our students, were forced to do that, and they were quite thankful for the ability that they.
And I've got a close friend of mine. She's also a CELTA trainer. She tells this story about when she did a work and travel in the US, and she got lost and she had to ask for directions. And when she asked for directions, the person gave her directions exactly like she had studied in her English class. And that was back in the day. She would have studied in the days of like Headway and English File and all of that. And the fact that all these expressions like go straight on, why do I need the on with straight, things like those? No, actually, when you hear it, when you understand that, this is what I'm going to hear in the real world. So there could also be a matter of the student not having enough experience working with English speakers.
Yeah, because again, coming back to experience of our students, I heard quite a lot from one of my students who eventually was brave enough to start watching movies in English. And every time for example, we learned a new expression or word with her during the lesson, next time she would say, you know what? I heard that. I heard them saying that. And every time she was so happy.
And there's quite a bit of research on this. The research shows, actually Caldwell's research on listening comprehension and processing really goes into a lot of depth on this. And he quotes John Field's research on listening processing when he talks about this. But one of Caldwell's main arguments is that when we listen to a bit of text, we listen to it for the meaning, and we actually don't pay that much attention in most cases to the precise words being used. As we listen for meaning, not for form. And that they might have heard this expression a billion times, but they were so focused on getting the meaning of what was said, they didn't pay attention to the exact words that were used. And then later on, when they heard the exact words that were used, it became something which they could notice. And this is going back to the research of Skian, who talks about the importance of noticing bits of language that you're studying in language learning, seeing that A is different from B, that B is used like this. And so that's a very important step for them in language learning.
All right. So next complaint will actually come from a lesson, a group lesson, not an individual class. So, when you ask to work your students with partner, some of them might complain that, but why do I need to work with a partner?
Yeah.
I might learn their mistakes. I don't know. We are wasting our time. Why do we need to do that?
Yeah, and the funny thing is that in my experience, it's usually not the stronger students who say that. It's usually the weaker students. And the funny thing is that they're the ones who are most likely that, like, if someone in the class was going to learn a mistake from somebody else, they would not be the ones who learned it. They would be the ones that gave it, in my experience. But I think this fear comes from a few different places. Well, one, it's this belief that if I hear the mistake from another student, that I might learn it, that I might take it on, that I might make more mistakes. And if I already know that I make a lot of mistakes, this could be something I'm really afraid of. So again, like, understanding where the student is coming from here. The second is that you also need to bear in mind their learning experiences. They might have had prior learning experiences where all communication was through the teacher, and where the students were not permitted or encouraged to speak to each other. Could be because they were being taught by a teacher who led to a teacher-centered classroom. Could be because they're not used to being autonomous learners. I deal with this quite a bit where I'm working now, is that the students, many of whom I work with, are not used to having any degree of learner autonomy. I mean, zero, absolutely. You put a worksheet on them for them to do individually, and they won't touch it because the teacher, what do I do with this? Not because they're lazy or because they don't want to do it, because they literally have so little autonomy. Or let's put it more accurately, that so little autonomy has been developed in them, because it's not their fault they don't have it, that they don't know what to do. I think all of these things play a factor when we think about, like, why do students hesitate to do this? I think it's worth having a talk with them about this, being very frank. One thing that I found useful here is to brainstorm with them pros and cons. Say, okay, yeah, you're right. You might learn mistakes from your peers. There's actually been research on this. They've researched this. They found that, well, it's actually quite unlikely that you'll do this, although it is possible, and there's anecdotal evidence of it happening. But although you might learn or pick up 1 or 2 or 3 mistakes over time, let's look at how this can help you. Well, it's going to give you additional chances for practice, which means that, well, you'll learn what you do learn correctly much better. It's going to give you the chance to develop your speaking fluency. It's going to give you the chance to interact with more people who have more styles of communication. It's going to give you the chance to have a bit more fun in the lesson. Well, that's also going to help learning. It's going to give you the chance to practice expressing yourself and listening to others express themselves more. And given the trade-off of possibly learning 1 or 2 or 3 mistakes from your partners, it looks like you're going to get much more out of it. And it's my job as the teacher to make sure that this doesn't happen as much as possible. So if it happens, and if there's a bit of mislearning, we'll correct it, we'll deal with it, and that'll be okay. So kind of also showing them that you're aware of this risk, but that you are going to take it on board, and that you will make it your responsibility to deal with this.
Which actually leads us to next complaint. When a student complains that my teacher doesn't correct me enough.
Right.
Or my teacher doesn't listen to me.
Right. Yeah, lack of feedback is a big issue. And if the students are making this complaint, I've been invited to, I can give a personal example of this. When I was working, my first job as a director of studies, it was for a private language school. We had about, at the time, about 600 students, I think. And I was invited in. One of our teachers, the students were complaining, said, our teacher doesn't listen to us. So, well, okay, I'll tell you what. They were very upset about this. So I said, okay, I'll tell you what, I'll come in, I'll watch the lesson. Come in, I'll watch the lesson. And the students were practicing giving presentations, teaching each other how to do a skill that they had, giving instructions. And the teacher, I watched them. First person gave the presentation. There was a small group, there's only 4 of them. First person gave the presentation. Of course, the others were all listening because they were engaged and were interested. So it serves a bit of live listening. They were practicing doing the things. having a bit of fun. Teacher sat there and listened. Second person stood up. Another 5-minute presentation, sat there and listened. Third person came up, 5-minute presentation, teacher sat there and listened. Fourth person came up, same thing. After all the presentations. All right, guys, okay, good work, let's move on. So if your students are complaining that you're not listening to them enough, really ask yourself first, am I listening to them enough? Am I providing enough feedback for them? And what are some examples of meaningful feedback that I have provided to the group and to individual students in the last 2 lessons? Not in the last month, but in the last 2 lessons. If you have trouble coming up with the answer to that, the answer really might well be that maybe you need to be a bit more in touch with your class. But let's say this isn't the case. Well, okay, let's say you think to yourself, oh, but I give them feedback all the time. Well, there's a difference between what we call input and uptake. So maybe you're giving them corrections. For example, let's say that you're echoing the correct response. They say, I am agree. You say, oh, I agree. They might not be noticing that this is happening. That is, you're correcting them, or they may not, even if they notice, they might not see it as important. They've not been involved in the process of receiving this feedback. So this could be part of it. In such cases, well, maybe if it's an on-the-spot correction, maybe rather than telling them, elicit the correction from them. Does that sound right? Stop them, make them involved in it if you're correcting on the spot. If it's controlled activity or something where you're not really focused on fluency, or if it's a mistake that the student kind of consistently has, or doing things like giving them a post-it note with a mistake on it, or sending them a message in the chat that's got the mistake and the correction. Give them a written record of it, or insist that they make a written record of it. Alternatively, if you're using delayed correction, well, the student might not understand that the mistake is theirs. They usually do if they have some degree of self-awareness. They might not. In which case, that's fine. You can actually ask them to reflect on this. So show them the mistakes on the board. Ask them which one, so after you've corrected, okay, which of these mistakes, and just ask them to think to themselves, I wouldn't make them say this out loud, which of these mistakes do you think could have been yours? It doesn't mean that it was yours necessarily this time, but you think, oh yeah, I've definitely said that in the past, that could be mine. So reflecting on maybe that was me, or maybe that could have been me. And the other thing would be maybe showing them sentences that you've heard from them, pointing out, okay guys, I heard this from you. I'm communicating with you where these sentences came from. They're not random. I heard this from you in the activity you were doing, and then giving them some sort of activity to correct them. The other thing that you can do is in the feedback stages, maybe ask them to report and comment on things that they've done. Ask one person, so what was the big takeaway? What was the most important thing, the most interesting thing, the silliest thing, that's the most surprising thing that you learned from your group? Comment on it, engage with them, and engage with their ideas beyond just like, okay, thank you, next. But like engage with them as humans. And that goes a long way to stemming this.
You know, I'm listening to you and I'm thinking to myself, sometimes when the students finish the task, for example, and the teacher having collected all the examples of good and bad language, puts everything on the board and starts the feedback. And sometimes students say, okay, so now our favorite part, our mistakes. Or, for example, when the teacher says, okay, so is this correct? Can we say like that? And the students always say, well, if you ask, then of course not.
Well, and that to me would say that, well, maybe your feedback is focusing a bit too much on the negative, because negative feedback is important, but it's equally important that I know when I'm doing something right. So maybe consider including a mix of correct and incorrect, or maybe consider if they've got, for example, the majority correct sentences, maybe you can do other things with those sentences. Maybe you can practice upgrading them, changing the register, practicing the pronunciation. There's always directions that you can go beyond correct. Correct isn't the stopping point.
That's a good point. Yeah, thank you. All right. So next one usually comes from parents. And well, I was probably lucky because in my experience, students and parents who I was lucky to work with usually parents, when they, for example, brought their small kids,
Right.
they usually asked and hoped that the lessons would be engaging and more in like a gamified environment.
Right.
Let's put it like that. Yeah. But sometimes, and I've actually heard this coming from some students. So after the class, yeah, when the class finishes, parents come to take kids home,
Yeah.
and ask them like, okay, so how was the lesson? What did you learn today? And kids say, I don't know, we're just playing the whole lesson. We're just running and playing. And the parents, they, of course, they may ask very logical questions. So
what am I paying for?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm paying for an English teacher, not a daycare. Yeah. So I think this problem comes from a couple of tiers. One, it could be the fact that the parents have very traditional beliefs about teaching and learning.
Mm-hmm.
And in such cases, educating them can be a good thing. So, well, okay, let's talk about child psychology. So children learn differently from adults. We know this. Here's this researcher, this researcher, this researcher. You do have to know what you're talking about in order to give that sort of an answer. But I would argue that if you work actively with teaching children, that knowing a bit about child psychology and psychology of learning and knowing enough about it to be able to explain it to parents is very important.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you can't communicate your methodology with the parents of your students, you're going to have lots of problems in the future. So I would educate myself in order to be able to do this. That would be port of call number one for me. Thing number two is, well, how much are you encouraging the students to reflect if they're giving that answer to their parents? One thing that I do at the end of my lessons, I've actually got out of the habit of it recently, but I need to get back in the habit of it, is at the end of the lesson, giving them a very simple, an exit ticket, a very simple tick box, which is, today I practiced, and it's got a picture of reading, speaking, writing, listening, or grammar there, something like that. And then it's got just below, I thought the lesson was fun. I thought the lesson was, how hard was it today? So to check in with the students. And getting them to do this after every lesson helps them kind of reflect and process what they've learned. Another way that you can do this sometimes, some teachers like doing this, is they'll introduce the aims at the beginning of the lesson. And then at the end of the lesson, they'll recap by, did we cover our aims today? Yes, yes, yes. Okay, I know what I did today. Which is also a good thing to do. I think you've got to be very careful with that in a language teaching environment, because if you start the aim of the lesson with, okay, guys, the lesson aim is we're going to practice the present perfect today. They've not studied it yet. That might switch them off. It might cause anxiety. But phrasing it as something like, okay, today we're going to learn how to talk about our life experiences. Now, I know that I'm going to teach them the present perfect to do that, but they don't know that. Not unless they know much more about the present perfect than they should know at this point, and they should probably be in a different class. But focusing them on the application as well. And then that's one issue. I think the second issue can come with this. I've also had this, is when you give lots of games, for example, to a class which is very motivated by fun, say a group of adults who are very motivated by fun and competition, but you have one person in the group who is not and wants a serious studying environment, typically get older students. And it's worth talking with them, and showing them kind of, well, okay, yeah, it's a game, but here's what you're practicing when you do this, bing, 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 bing. And the second is saying, well, okay, I understand that you feel that way, and thank you for letting me know. You are in a group of 12 students. So how can we compromise so that your needs are met, but so that we're not also doing something which is going to harm the other 12 students in the class? So what compromise can we come to here? And letting them be aware of the fact that they are not the only person in the classroom. Because there are lots of students who, even teachers, who are not always aware of that, who may be used to studying with private teachers, or who think that they are the only student in the class, or that whatever they think, that everyone thinks the same as me. So, because very often, like one thing that's happened, I've had this in a CPE preparation class once that I was teaching. One of the students, oh, they were complaining about something. They said, no, the whole class feels like I do. So the whole class, everybody feels this way. Oh, yes. So the next class, I gave them an anonymous survey.
Yeah.
So guys, I've heard there's a problem with some things. I'm going to make this anonymous. Can you please just put what you think is true? Well, it turned out that she was the only person who thought that. In a group of 10 students, she was the only person who thought that way. And I was able to show the data after that and say, so, okay, look, it's anonymous. So let's look. Okay, so 9 of us feel like this way. 1 of us feels like this. So, okay, like, so we've got to go with the majority here. Sorry. Like, so if you're the one, feel free to talk to me after class and we'll see what kind of compromise we can make. But I've got 9-1 here. Sorry.
Yeah, that's actually a very, very good point. And I don't know. I was probably lucky because I never dealt with that. But I think that a lot of teachers can take something from that. So going to the next one I've got here. Actually, this one comes from my own experience. Just recently, I was teaching Future Perfect and Future Perfect Continuous. Yeah. And you know how students usually go, okay, so do they really use this structure?
Yeah.
Why do we need to learn this? Oh, I've never heard them saying that. And you know, I usually say that, well, if you have never noticed that, or it doesn't mean that it didn't exist.
Absolutely.
So I'm sure that all of us have at least once heard that complaint from our students. So again, Chris,
what can we do here?
Yeah.
Well, first, I would say that most of the time when you hear this comment, it's because something was introduced in kind of a decontextualized way. Like if you stand up in front of your class and you say, okay, class, today we're going to say the present perfect. You go through all the rules, but they've not really got any context for how that's used, which it happens in lots of language classrooms, but it is a bit weird when you think about it, because imagine the same thing happening in figure skating. Like, you're not just going to walk in and see a figure skating coach say, okay, do this spin. Like, no, it's going to be, okay, here's the routine as a whole. Here's what we're doing here. Now, here's the spin here that we're going to practice. Like, you wouldn't see that in, I don't know, a half-decent boxing gym. In a boxing gym, they're not going to say, okay, do this. They're going to say, okay, here's the situation that we're working with. He does this, I do this, here's my answer, but now we're going to practice this. So having context is really, really important here. So usually when they say, well, when am I ever going to use this? What they're actually telling you is, I do not have sufficient context in my understanding of the language to know how to use this. Which means that, well, maybe they need some more noticing activities. Maybe they need to practice working with it. So if they haven't taught it yet, we want to preempt it. A text-based presentation is a good way of doing this. Give them the text and ask them to go back through and underline more examples of it. If you've got an example of a text with lots of examples of your structure, this can be really helpful. Other activities that you can use to help promote this are things like dictogloss, where you take a short text with 50, 60 words, you read it to the students, you let them make notes, and then they reconstruct it. But very often they won't reconstruct it with the right tenses, the right things like that. So you can point them and say, oh, well, look, you've got the main idea right, but they've used this tense here and you haven't. So let's think about what the difference is and why they've used this and why you haven't. And a bit of the word contrastive analysis be quite helpful here.
Again, you know, very often students might say, okay, so, but if I say like that, won't they understand me?
Well, they might understand you generally, but will they understand exactly what you want to say? And this goes back to this point about, are you happy with people kind of understanding you? Or do you want people to understand you? Because again, actually, I think we're a really good example of this because like we both speak second languages.
Yeah.
Obviously, you speak your second language much better than I speak my second language. But there does come a point where the ability to express yourself precisely in that second language becomes really important.
Yeah.
Because there are times where, for whatever reason, you want your listener to understand you exactly.
Not just generally, yes.
Not just generally. And for example, for us, like we actually can both resort back to our L1s and get the message across. But like lots of, if we take couples as an example, lots of couples aren't the same boat. There's lots of, people who maybe it's French with American, and the American, of course, because he's American, only speaks English. And the French and the French person speaks, English is their second language, or maybe they want to be understood. It's really important that their listener understand exactly how they feel.
Mm-hmm.
So for that reason, I mean, asking the learners is putting on them, like, are you happy with someone understanding you kind of, sort of, or do you want them to understand you?
Sometimes, I also want to say that, okay, so learning a second language is about respect. Yeah. Respecting this language that you're learning. And if the language is the way it is, then, well, you have to accept that fact.
Yeah.
You have to respect that. And if you don't like it, then why are you learning it?
Yeah,
why are you wasting your time on that?
Yeah, it's like the same thing. Like I don't complain about word order in Russian and Ukrainian, because that's all. I don't complain about it. It's just a fact of life.
Right.
Or it's like, why do you use this instead of this? Well, you just do sometimes. And yeah, there's a rule for it, but at the end of the day, it is what it is.
How many times you have messed up a prefix or a suffix, which is like, yeah.
Oh, and I always, when I get it wrong catastrophically. Yeah. But yeah.
In a funny, wrong way.
Yeah.
All right. Next one is about, when you give your learners a task to work on, and normally something, for example, to speak about at next. Yeah. So you want the learners to prepare, to think about what they're gonna say, to take notes, or to make notes, maybe even use Google to, I don't know.
Yeah.
Look up some information, and they say, I don't need that. I can just start. I'll improvise that. Why do I need to prepare? I'll be fine.
Well, there's two ways you can deal with that. One is you can try to, let's say one is the negotiation, where you say, well, okay, but let's make it really good.
Mm-hmm.
They sometimes will go for that, sometimes they don't. Which gets you to strategy number 2, which is indulgent. Fine, start. Let them get to the point where they're struggling and say, okay, now we're going to do it again. But this time, make notes, show how you can do it better.
But don't help them at this point.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't help them at this point. I would let them just work.
Mm-hmm.
So I would, and you can let them on their own make notes, because if they don't feel the need, they're not going to do it. But when you let them run into a problem, say, okay, and sometimes it's helpful to be very direct with them and say, okay, well, you've given it a shot, but I think you can do much better than that.
Mm-hmm.
So this time, or sometimes being painfully honest with them and saying, like, that wasn't very good. So you told me you could do it. And I would be very, very, I want to really qualify this one. If you know that someone's given 100% of their effort, never, ever say this to them. But if you know that someone has not given 100% effort, this is a very fair comment. And if they've said, no, I don't need to, I'll just go. Well, to me, that's not 100% effort.
Mm-hmm.
Because 100% effort would be making really good notes and preparing everything. And just saying, well, sorry, that wasn't very good. We had this problem, this problem, this problem. Let's prepare to do it again, trying to fix these issues. And this honest feedback, you've got to be very careful with it. But many learners do appreciate it. especially if this is done privately. I wouldn't give this, like if you're teaching one-to-ones, this is fine. I wouldn't do this in front of a group of students. I might talk to them privately during the task. Say, looks like you're having some problems here.
Sometimes it is actually very beneficial to tell them all that it wasn't good enough. And
no. And I think the other thing as well is if they've done some rubbish, especially if you teach kids. I work with kids, so that happens regularly. They'll do some crap, and I say, guys, that was rubbish. What are we doing? Come on, let's do it right this time. Go through the instructions, make them do it again. And sometimes we're going to do it again until we do it right.
Yeah. The last complaint, which actually is also about taking notes. For example, when you clarify, I don't know, some present perfect, let's say, and you put everything on the board very nicely, and then you ask, for example, your students to copy that in their copy books, and they say, well, can I just take a picture of it? Why can't I just take a picture of it? Teacher, I don't want to spend this time. We're wasting time.
Yeah. And this is there's lots of reasons that you can do this. Let's talk about why you might do it in a group versus a one-to-one lesson. One bit of advice that I was given a very long time ago by one of my mentors was during the open class discussion part of clarification, you ask the learners to put their pens down and focus on you. Focus on the discussion. And then you give them a set amount of time, 3 minutes, 4 minutes afterwards to make their notes, make their copies. This can do a lot of things for a class. One is that if you know that someone struggled while everyone else is copying their notes, you can go down to that student and just talk them through it one more time while the rest of the class is copying down. Second has to do with memory. There's a lot of research showing that we actually even had professors in university. This was well known back when I was in university, which was a long time ago at this point, that handwriting notes is so much better for your memory because it's such a fine motor skill. Like holding a pen and writing is actually extremely hard for your brain to do. It's such a fine motor skill that you actually remember much better when you write things by hand. And what they found is that writing things by hand leads to much better recall and learning than even typing. But even more than that, that taking a picture of something actually leads to worse recall of an event. That it's been demonstrated that when you take a picture of something, it's not that you remember it the same degree, you actually remember it worse than you would have if you had not taken a picture.
Let's be honest, we never, almost never go to our gallery and have a look at those photos. Almost never.
I remember I was doing CELTA once, and we had a group for the inputs where we would send all the materials for the inputs. And we would always post it there. Nothing ever got deleted. All the handouts, everything got posted there. And towards the end of the course, one of the trainees complained, and they said, "Oh, but it would be so nice if you shared the materials from the sessions with us." And we're like, "Have you looked in the Telegram group? Like everything's there from the beginning of the course." And like, really? We're like, you've used this every single input. It hadn't come to them. It just had never occurred to them that maybe keeping notes and an organized notebook is my responsibility. And that is kind of something that
it also comes, to some, I don't know, qualities and probably skills to be a student.
Yes.
Because not everyone can actually be a student.
Oh yeah, my students right now, I teach early secondary. And so I've got a class of 9th graders right now who have been online because of COVID for the last 2 years. And their studying skills, bear in mind that they've been online for 7th grade and 8th grade, which is where you actually learn a lot of your study skills in early secondary. And they are so far behind in their study skills that it's like teaching primary schoolers sometimes, in that they don't know, like you teach them a new word, the idea of, okay, here's the new word, I'm going to record it with the definition, with the example. They don't have this skill of, even sometimes, of, I'm going to organize them in a list, and the list is going to have a heading.
Simple things like that. All right, so let's sum up our talk. In general, what advice can you give? How can teachers deal with students who are complaining?
Well, I think we've got to take a very sensitive point of view with this. I think point number one is that we have to make sure that the students feel heard and that we understand their point of view. If we just immediately start telling them that they're wrong, they're going to switch off, they're going to become confrontational. So the first thing is showing them that you understand their point of view, where they're coming from, and what they are worried about. This is going to do a lot, because so much of complaining is just wanting to feel heard.
Of course,
the second is explain your rationale and your reasoning to them. So, okay, I understand what you're worried about and what you're afraid of. Here's what I'm thinking. Now, I'm not going to say that I'm the expert and I'm right, so you must listen to me, but I'm going to explain to you what I'm thinking. Could you please just hear me out? Give practical examples, if you can, of times when your approach has worked. This can be very, very helpful. Say, okay, I've seen this work because this happened, and we found this result. So I do have some experience. I'm not just making this up on the spot. Because for the learners, everybody thinks they know how to be a teacher, because everyone's been through school, and most people have the experience of teaching somebody else something. So everyone thinks they know how to be a teacher. And in all fairness, like, not everyone's had experience of being a doctor. Not everyone's had experience of being a carpenter. Not everyone's had experience of being a plumber. But almost everybody's had some experience at some point in their life of being a teacher. So everyone thinks that they know more about it than they really do, very often. So giving practical examples helps to show that, no, actually, I do know what I'm doing here. I would also try to very sensitively highlight how their needs might be linked to their beliefs. So, for example, one example of this is if I take I might learn my partner's mistakes. So I would just say, well, like, when I look at you, I can see why you're worried about this, because accuracy is one of your issues. And I don't mean anything bad by that. That's just, that's one of the things that we need to work on with you. But it could be that because you believe that you're just going to learn mistakes, that you're not engaging with the tasks as much, and therefore you're not getting as much out of them as you could be getting, which is actually slowing down your progress. So kind of show them how what they believe might have an effect on what problems they're having. You might highlight for them that they just might not have noticed something. So the point that you were mentioning earlier, Nataly, was that, well, just because you haven't noticed it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It just means that you're not aware of it. But it's also worth bearing in mind that if you haven't noticed something, then to you, it doesn't exist. So we've got to bear this in mind, that we're also working with their understanding of the world and of language, that we may need to adjust a little bit. And I think two more things that can be very helpful are, well, brainstorming with them pros and cons. So if they say, why do we do this like this? Say, okay, well, let's I'm not going to tell you what's wrong, what's up. I'm going to say, let's think about it together. Why should we do this? Why shouldn't we do this? Okay, we play games. Why should we do this? Why shouldn't we do this? Okay, where even learning 500 synonyms for angry. Well, Why is it good to do this? Why could it be a bad thing to do this? And usually, if we're doing something half decent, that pros list is going to outweigh the cons list. But because they've been involved in the process, it's now not your idea against theirs. It is now their idea. And the last thing is we'll try to find a compromise. Say, okay, well, I'll promise to do this. One of the things that I've, for example, seen is when I've got groups that when they say, well, teacher, you don't correct us if we want to be corrected more. I'll say, okay, well, I'll tell you what. I will, on the next lesson, correct every single mistake that you make. Mm-hmm. But you've got to promise that you'll write them all down. Mm-hmm. And then afterwards, you show it, you make it actually a big interruption. Say, okay, how did that feel? Oh, well, teacher. And I always make a point of not being the most sensitive when I'm doing this. So how did that feel? So, well, teacher, not very good. So do you understand now why I don't correct everything? It's like, did you always know how to correct? No, not always. For some of them, harder to implement now. So show them that, well, I'm not correcting everything because I'm correcting the things that I think you can reasonably correct now. Mm-hmm. I'm giving you this bite-sized bit of information that you can apply immediately. And if I keep giving you these over time, we will get there.
Right. Chris, thank you very much for helping us out here, because I think that everyone right now has a toolkit, and even I learned a couple of tricks from you today. So I hope that this will help us deal with such complaints in the classroom. And well, thank you everyone for watching us and devoting your time to this podcast. Please leave your comments and subscribe to our channel not to miss our next videos.